Originally, when I reviewed the material in question back in 2018, I made a huge mistake. The review was for the single-issue comic book, not the completed graphic novel. I was unaware there was another fully expanded version available. So I'm going to open with my 2018 self, looking at the 24-page comic, and then transition to the complete graphic novel. But first, some background information. Jeffrey Dahmer was a serial criminal who operated in Milwaukee, Wisconsin during the 80s. However, in 1991, he had a spree of activity, which led to him being captured. In total, it was discovered he had 17 separate victims, all of whom were gay men he tempted into his home with free booze, cash, and other adult activities. The specifics of his crime are not only horrendous and inhuman, but they would likely get this video banned. All that can be mentioned is he had a tendency to preserve and keep a number of body parts, and his overall obsession seemed to be creating a, zombie servant. He also had, let's call it, abnormal eating habits. Upon his arrest, it was determined he was sane and he faced a trial. He pled guilty to all charges and was sentenced to the full extent of the law. In essence, he would never experience freedom again. What remained of his natural life would be spent behind bars. In 1994, another inmate repeatedly served Dahmer a final judgment with a metal bar to his head. Dahmer succumbed to his injuries later that day. With that unpleasantness out of the way, let's discuss the comic and then the graphic novel. My Friend Dahmer, a comic published in 2002, written and illustrated by Derf, is the creator's personal encounters with the teenage Jeffrey Dahmer slightly before he began following the dark urges in his head. It breaks down into 3 pieces that highlight some of Dahmer's unusual habits and the mistreatment he experienced in high school. Now, I have to admit that I struggled with this material, not because of the subject or because of the stories, but because I simply don't see the point of this comic. There's very little, if any, insight into the personality of Dahmer. And despite the implications of the title, the author puts as much distance as possible between himself and the notorious figure. The two were, at best, casual acquaintances, not friends, if the material is an accurate representation of their interactions. I mean, that's an understandable approach. No one wants to be directly or indirectly associated with a universally despised figure. Nor does one have to admit they were close enough to the person to realize their oddball behavior was indicative of a psychopathology that would lead to multiple unalivings. So again, one has to ask, what's the point of this material? I think it's simply a journalistic approach to the topic. It displays the facts of the author's perspective and tries to be a true representation of their experiences. The end result is confirmation of what was already presumed, namely that Dahmer was a pretty strange guy that no one liked. In other words, it provides nothing new and simply confirms what was already known. This is why it's a controversial piece of work. The material neither condemns the subject nor does it provide a reasonable, well-formed context to understand the subject. Overall, it provides nothing new to the topic. Therefore, this journalistic approach, coupled with the slightly misleading nature of the title, gives the material the appearance of cashing in on the notoriety of an infamous public figure. I genuinely don't think that's an accurate description of the material, though. However, at the same time, I have to acknowledge it doesn't contain anything worthwhile or revealing. My Friend Dahmer, an expanded graphic novel released in 2012, is a far more interesting piece of work. In the introduction, Derf explains that the first story, written and drawn in 1997 and published in 00 number 18, received a good reception from the audience. This inspired him to expand it into a 100-page graphic novel. However, he was unable to get a publisher interested. In the end, he ended up self-publishing it as the previously mentioned comic, but it wasn't a piece of work he felt satisfied with. Over the next 10 years, he did additional research and gave it a far more cohesive narrative. And this time, it works as intended. The material is sympathetic to a point, but as Derf states, the moment Dahmer takes his disturbed thoughts and puts them into action, that's where the sympathy ends. Organically, the book reads like a catalog of disturbing behavior that was overlooked repeatedly by everyone who could have and should have intervened and changed this individual's path. There were some pretty obvious warning signs and patterns of behavior that telegraphed a rather dark future. Yet, because Dahmer was simply a weirdo that was barely tolerated, his behavior wasn't given a second thought. Wisely, Derf allows the artwork to do most of the storytelling. That is, his narration is kept to a minimum without too much commentary. It's very quiet in that regard, but it's also a disturbing, uncomfortable silence. It reveals more than one might expect. In fact, the narration provided is very tight. It provides context, but it doesn't get too elaborate and try too hard to explain more than necessary. The story involves Dahmer's evolution, so to speak, from a troubled outcast into an alcoholic, disturbed young adult. There was cruelty and loneliness, and a developing person who was left alone with his unchecked, unbelievably cruel thoughts. He didn't have to hide what was going on inside him. In fact, he didn't even try to hide what he was becoming, because those around him simply didn't care. Certainly, his psychotic tendencies weren't encouraged. At the same time, they were tolerated by anyone who saw them on display, because ultimately, Dahmer inspired apathy. On the surface, he was just another small-town loser that would be forgotten once everyone graduated and moved on with their lives. His fate, from a generic perspective, was to work at a mall, live in a tiny apartment, and do nothing significant. Possibly, he'd be an anecdote, but more than likely, he'd just be forgotten. Ultimately, what makes this graphic novel work is it's neither salacious, as some works based on serial criminals tend to be, nor is it detached, like the prior comic. Some scenes are reasonably unsettling, as they should be, but they don't cross the line into an overly depraved depiction that shocks for the sake of being shocking. As an examination of a public figure, My Friend Dahmer is chilling. I might even say it ends on a perfect metaphorical note. Dahmer is spotted walking down the middle of a dark road. An acquaintance sees him and drives him home, unaware that Dahmer's first dismembered victim is in the trunk of Dahmer's parked car. In other words, Dahmer was walking his dark path, alone with his even darker thoughts, and on that day in late June of 1978, he safely made it home. The journey of his mind had been put into action successfully. Over the next decade, he would continue to walk that lonely path, picking up strangers, bringing them home, and introducing them to his darkness. Thank you for watching. Usually, this is where I would display all the people who have memberships and directly support this channel. Due to the subject matter, I thought this might be a topic some might not want their name associated with, so I'm erring on the side of caution and leaving this space blank. But thanks to all those people nonetheless. If you're new, I highly suggest you check out the channel archive for more comics and graphic novels you might enjoy.